The viewSource podcast recently did a really cool episode talking about some different approaches to creating custom blocks. I thought I would take the opportunity to show how you can use those same approaches in Wicked Block Builder. If you haven't already checked out the episode, I'll include a link to the episode in the video's description, so check it out. So in the episode, they show a couple more approaches to creating blocks. In a previous episode, they had talked about using ACF to create a block. And in this episode, they talk about two other approaches. One is using InnerBlocks, and another is building basically a completely custom block. So, for example, we have two really basic blocks here that just have a picture and say hello world. They look the same, but they're built a little bit differently. This first block uses something called InnerBlocks. And what InnerBlocks is a way to combine core blocks into a template. So for example, if we click on this image, we'll see that we have all of the controls, settings that you would expect and that are included in the core image control. Same as when you click into this heading here. All of the settings that are part of the heading block, you can change the heading level, all of those things. In this second block, it's a little bit different. We're using an image component, which is part of Wicked Block Builder in this case, to be able to select an image. And we have a rich text area that lets us type in our headline. It also puts out an H3. However, it's not a block, it's just a rich text area. So we can type into it if we want, but we can't change the heading level, and we don't have all of the settings that come with the heading block. So let's go over how we can create these two different blocks and some of the pros and cons to each approach. So let's start with the InnerBlocks approach. I'll come over here to Wicked Block Builder and add a new block. I'll call this block Hello World InnerBlocks. And for InnerBlocks, this should be a very simple block. I'm just going to add a div for our root element, and then I'm going to add an InnerBlocks component. And what you can do with the InnerBlocks component is you can define a template. So by that I mean you can choose what InnerBlocks you want to make up the template. So in this case, we're going to have an image block. So this will be a core image block. And we'll add another InnerBlock, this time a headline, or a heading, excuse me. And what we can do is, while we're doing this, is pass attributes to the InnerBlocks. So for example, if we want to set the level of the heading block to a 3, which will make it an H3, we can pass that attribute here. We can also pass an attribute for the content of the block. So we'll say just content here, for example. Actually, I'll change it to heading. And I'll put in some styles that I've already created. So here we have our styles, and so what we're doing is, I forgot to add this to our block, but I'll go ahead and add it. And so what we're doing is just adding some styles to get our block to look the way we want. So the core image block outputs a figure tag, so that's why we're targeting that. And then we're also going to have a heading tag that's going to be an H3 that is going to be our other InnerBlock, so we're also targeting that as well in the CSS. So let's just see what this looks like if we add it to a page. I'll refresh. And let's see. Here's Hello World InnerBlocks. The styling does not look right. That's because I forgot to add the class. So I'm just jumping back over here to the editor, the block editor that is, or block builder, I should say. And I'm going to wrap this InnerBlocks component with a div, and I'm going to give it a class call it Hello World InnerBlocks. So let's just see if that fixes it. Okay, so now it looks a little bit better. We can choose our image. We can change our heading if we want. And lastly, what I'm going to do is just change the block to include settings for the background color so that we can set that. So just refresh. Now if we click in our block, we can set our background color. So that's it as far as creating a block comprised of inner blocks. What's nice about using this InnerBlocks component is that you can control your template. So you can use any core blocks that you want, and you can predefine the template so that anytime this block is added in the editor, you get those blocks added by default. You could probably do the same thing with a pattern if you wanted as well. This just gives you a little bit more control. Plus you can go back and edit this after the fact anytime you want, which is a little bit easier to update than a pattern. The other, I would say, advantage to this approach is that if you want all of the controls and settings that come with the core blocks, then you'll get those. For example, we've added this image block here, so we can do anything that comes with the image block. So we can make the corners rounded or straight, anything else that you want to do. Same thing with the heading block. The downside, I would say, in my opinion, to this approach is that you have less control. And so, for example, if down the road WordPress adjusts the markup for the image block, for example, say instead of outputting a figure tag, they decide to wrap it in a div for whatever reason, or maybe something else changes that causes the markup to change. And because our styles are so closely attached to the core blocks and their tags and possibly their classes, depending on how you do your styling, then if any of that changes, then there's a good chance that your block could break. So kind of some pros and cons to this approach. So let's see what it would look like to create a block using our own markup. So let's create another new block. We'll call this Hello World block. And for this one, I'm going to add some attributes so that we can track some of the things. For example, we're going to be able to select an image. So I'm going to add an image ID attribute to store the ID of the image that's selected. And I'm going to add an attribute for the headline. And now we'll create the markup for our block. So I'll add a div, and I'm going to give it a class. I'll call it Hello World block. I'm going to add another div and give this one a class of photo. And inside this div, I'm going to add an image component. We'll map it to our image ID. And I'll add another div, and I'm going to give this a class of content. This is just an example. Obviously, you could create your block however you wanted and assign whatever classes you want. But the point in this example is that you control the markup. So this markup can be whatever you want. You have full control over it. So let's continue with this. I'll add a rich text component to our content and map it to the headline. Give it some placeholder text. And I'm going to make it an H3 tag. So basically what we have here is when this block gets loaded in the editor, it's going to output a div with a class of Hello World block. Nested within that is another div. This one has a class of photo. And nested within that div is an image component that will let us select our image. Then we have another div for our content, and finally a rich text element within that. So let's add in our styles. So these styles are what will make the block look the way we want. But again, the point here is that we control the markup. So we're going to style our block based on these classes. But the nice thing about this approach is that we don't have to worry about this markup changing because, sorry about that, because we create the markup. You know, if when a new version of WordPress comes out, if any of the core blocks have changed, our markup isn't going to change. So we don't have to worry about that. So let's add this block. Okay, so here's our hello world block. We can select an image, type in hello world. And again, I'm going to go back to the block and turn on the color supports for background. I'll leave text on as well, but mainly I just want to be able to select the background for the block. Okay, so here's our background. So with this block, it's going to output the markup that we have defined. So it's a bit more controlled because in this case, we don't have all of the controls that come with like the image core block. So we don't have to worry about whoever's using our block changing the image settings if we don't want them to. You know, maybe if you do want to include that ability, then maybe InnerBlocks would be a better approach. But in this approach, we have a little bit more control over the block. Same thing with the headline. This is going to output an H3 no matter what, because that's what we've defined. However, if, you know, some point down the road we decide, oh, you know, actually it should be an H2, you know, it's no problem. We can just update it, and our block will update. So that's just kind of an overview of how you can use these two approaches using Wicked Block Builder. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll be happy to get back to you. Thanks for watching.